Plenty of films are based on true stories, including the 2007 adventure drama film Into the Wild. The movie follows the life of Chris McCandless, who went out to explore the Alaskan wilderness in the 1990s and never returned home. Chris's story is an inspirational one, but it's also pretty heartbreaking too. After all, the man passed away doing something that he'd been passionate about for years. Many have been fascinated to understand more about his life and what drove him to set off on such a dangerous mission ever since. Wanting to explore the Alaskan wilderness is a noble desire. However, it's also pretty reckless if you're not particularly prepared. The environment can be incredibly dangerous, so having the right gear can make the difference between whether or not you survive. Unfortunately, it seems that Chris McCandless might not have had everything he needed for the trip. It may come as a surprise that he was so underprepared, given Chris was no stranger to exploring the wilderness. It's something he'd been doing for much of his adult life, so he knew how tough it could be to make it in the middle of nowhere. Chris believed he could live off the land, but things didn't work out. If you get lost in the wild and lose your life, it can be a while before anyone finds you. In some cases, you might stay missing forever. Thankfully, that wasn't what happened to Chris McCandless. 2 hunters came across him on September 6, 1992, when they found his body hidden inside an abandoned bus. The pair didn't actually know that he'd lost his life at first. That's because the first thing they saw was an SOS note asking for help. It revealed that he was weak and injured, likely on the verge of passing away. He also wrote that he was out collecting berries, although the hunters soon realized this wasn't the case. The true story of Into the Wild wouldn't be so heartbreaking if it had a happy ending. Unfortunately, while biographical movies might sometimes embellish the facts, this was something the 2007 film couldn't really change. Chris McCandless lost his life in the wilderness, and by the time the hunters arrived, he'd reportedly already been gone for 19 days. The duo that found him initially thought there was a bag full of rotten food on the bus. However, they quickly discovered that it was actually just Chris's remains. The only sign of humanity left was the diary that was with him detailing his experiences in the wild. It offered an insight into his life that only Chris had. Chris McCandless might not have survived in the wild, but his adventure did last more than 100 days. Plenty of people without his experience wouldn't have managed nearly as long, especially on their own. Chris was determined not to have help, although he did rely on the assistance of another man to help him start his journey. To get from South Dakota to Alaska, McCandless reportedly hitched rides from strangers. It was an effective way of covering distance when he didn't really have any money to his name. One person that picked him up was Jim Gallion. The electrician had no idea at the time that he'd be the last person ever to see Chris alive. Jim Gallion apparently didn't mind helping Chris McCandless out with getting to Fairbanks. However, he reportedly couldn't help but be concerned by how unprepared his passenger seemed to be. Jim allegedly feared that the guy wouldn't survive in the wild without many supplies. He had a right to be concerned, but Chris was apparently determined not to have help. Gallion reportedly tried to convince McCandless to delay his trip or let him buy some extra supplies, but the explorer wouldn't have it. In the end, the only thing he allegedly accepted were some rubber boots and potentially some food. Jim hoped that Chris would give up on his adventure once starvation set in, but that wasn't the case. It appears that not only did Chris McCandless enter the Alaska wilderness with little supplies, but he also allegedly left some of what he owned in Jim Gallion's truck. Supposedly, his map and watch were abandoned in the vehicle, meaning Chris could only rely on the landscape for navigation. That had the potential to make his adventure more dangerous. According to Chris's diary, which has been instrumental in piecing together the true story of Into the Wild, it was the explorer's plan to hike to the Bering Sea. Doing this without the proper navigation tools would be tough, but McCandless believed in himself. That confidence had gotten him this far, and he couldn't afford to lose it now. It was 20 miles in that Chris McCandless's adventure reportedly took a positive turn. This is where he found Bus 142, an abandoned vehicle in the middle of a forest that offered him the perfect shelter. Sure, it was run down, having been left in the middle of nowhere. However, it was warmer than outside and could keep the elements out. It's fortunate that he found the bus, given McCandless allegedly entered the Alaskan wilderness without a tent. We know that he had a sleeping bag, as this is what the hunters apparently found his body in. However, that wouldn't do much without some extra shelter. Chris really was determined to live on the edge with this adventure. Unfortunately, this is where the true story of Into the Wild takes a sad turn. While Chris McCandless did indeed have shelter, he lacked plenty of other essentials for survival. This included food. The explorer was more than prepared to hunt down his meals, but it seems he didn't have much luck catching anything significant. Apparently, most of the animals he succeeded in hunting were squirrels and geese, which didn't offer much for him to eat. Although Chris did allegedly catch a caribou once, he never got to use it in a meal. That's because the meat allegedly went rotten before he had a chance. Things didn't look good for Chris. Food wasn't the only thing that caused problems in the true story of Into the Wild. While Bus 142 was Chris McCandless's safe haven, it wasn't where he planned on ending his adventure. He intended to keep progressing through the Alaskan wilderness, but Chris encountered a problem when he reached Teklanika River. He didn't know how to cross it. Judging by the speed it was allegedly going, crossing the river would almost certainly result in him losing his life. Although his Alaskan adventure evidently wasn't without its risks, there were some things that apparently even Chris wasn't willing to do. If he couldn't cross the river, though, how could Chris achieve his goal of reaching the Bering Sea? Chris McCandless reportedly acknowledged in his diary that he might have been in a better situation if he still had his map. With that at his disposal, he could have potentially planned a safe route across the river so he could continue on his journey. Chris also might have been able to see that there was salvation nearby. The true story of Into the Wild has some tragic turns, and this is easily one of the worst of them. It appears McCandless was only a mile away from a cabin of supplies and a hand-operated tram. As much as he might not have wanted to rely on help, the food that was here could have saved his life. After you've set your heart on something, it's tough to admit defeat. That was especially the case for someone like Chris McCandless, who reportedly had experience risking his life on adventures like this. Unfortunately, he apparently knew he had to give up on his mission or lose his life. So, Chris wrote in his diary that he was heading home. Sadly, this is where the true story of Into the Wild takes another brutal turn. It appears that McCandless was trapped because the river he'd crossed to reach this point had widened significantly. Thanks to melting snow and thawing ice, it was apparently now 75 foot wide. He couldn't cross it, so he had to return to Bus 142, feeling dejected. History is full of famous diaries, and the one that Chris McCandless wrote deserves to be up there with the best. The document is the only thing in existence that can tell us the true story of Into the Wild, given that McCandless isn't with us anymore. Of course, this diary isn't as informative as some might like. It seems that Chris's entries reportedly became less detailed as time went on because he was losing energy. He was apparently using more than the amount he was consuming, leading him to become weaker by the day. The last words Chris wrote were on day 107, with the hunters not finding him until day 132. If Chris McCandless had managed to last for a few more weeks, he might have still been alive when the hunters reached the bus. If that had happened, the true story of Into the Wild might have had a very different ending. Unfortunately, the explorer couldn't hold on any longer and passed away long before anyone could help him. Most people assume that starvation was responsible for Chris losing his life. If he was unable to find much to eat and kept using more energy than he was putting into his body, then it makes sense. Starvation does some horrific damage to the body, meaning the explorer sadly might not have left this world comfortably and peacefully. Although starvation is the general consensus, some believe other factors might have played a role. John Krakauer, author of the book Into the Wild, proposed a different theory. Chris may have eaten Hedysarum alpinum seeds, which aren't normally dangerous, but in his weakened state could have proved fatal. Krakauer's theory carried weight due to his expertise in wilderness survival. However, later tests allegedly found no harmful toxins in the seeds, casting doubt on the claim. Still, Ronald Hamilton later suggested Chris might have suffered from lathyrism due to ODAP poisoning from the same seeds, something earlier studies might have missed because they weren't testing for amino acids. While food-related causes remain the focus, others have speculated that conditions within the abandoned bus where Chris stayed Bus 142 might have contributed. Some believe mold inside the bus caused health issues, potentially digestive in nature, which weakened him further in his isolated state. Chris McCandless vanished into the Alaskan wilderness alone, where he ultimately lost his life. Despite this, much of his story was pieced together through photographs and diary entries. His images reveal the toll his journey took on his body, yet his smile remained constant. Even when acknowledging the possibility of death, Chris appeared content. His adventure was undeniably perilous, demanding immense courage and endurance. Chris had demonstrated both during earlier trips, including a cross-country journey from Virginia to California in 1,990. Driving a beat-up Datsun without insurance or valid plates, he traveled despite setbacks like repeated breakdowns and mechanical failures. He eventually reached Lake Mead National Recreation Area near Nevada and Arizona, but a flash flood rendered his car useless. Facing the risk of arrest due to the car's registration issues, he removed the plates and abandoned it. Interestingly, the vehicle was later refurbished and used as an undercover police car. Chris spent the following months living away from home, often in solitude. In late 1990 and early 1991, he stayed in hermit camps in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Though the lifestyle was simple, it wasn't without controversy he was suspected of cabin burglaries in the area, though never proven guilty. If he was involved, it was likely due to desperation. After leaving the Sierra Nevada, he reportedly traveled in a circular route through California, Arizona, and South Dakota, eventually kayaking part of the way to Colorado. This risky trip earned him notoriety with local rangers, as he lacked proper gear, training, or licensing. Despite this, he evaded capture. Chris also crossed into Mexico via the Morelos Dam spillway using his kayak. However, life there proved too challenging, and he soon returned to the U.S., only to be arrested for possessing a firearm he'd bought with the kayak. He was briefly detained and later released, minus the weapon. Following this, Chris headed back to South Dakota, unknowingly approaching the final chapter of his life. It was during this period that the events of Into the Wild truly began. Although unaware of his impending fate, Chris never seemed to regret the choices he made. He cherished the way he had lived freely, on his own terms. Chris was reportedly so passionate about becoming one with the wilderness that he once quit his job as a grain elevator operator in South Dakota. For those who knew Chris McCandless, it might not be a surprise that his life ended the way that it did. The true story of Into the Wild reveals that he was passionate about surviving on his own. However, this wasn't because he lacked any other skills. In fact, he was allegedly quite successful at school. According to reports from his high school, he was academically gifted. Chris also managed to balance good grades with being captain of the cross-country team. That doesn't mean he always fit in with everyone around him, though. Given his academic success at high school, it's probably no great surprise that Chris McCandless ended up going to college. He eventually graduated in 1990 with double majors in anthropology and history, subjects that gave him a deeper understanding of the world. Some of the areas he reportedly excelled in included contemporary African politics and history of anthropological thought. Having done exceptionally well, Chris could have easily built a successful career for himself. However, that wasn't what he wanted out of life. That's why he reportedly donated his 24/0 savings to Oxfam and began to spend most of his time outside, only working when it was absolutely necessary. Chris was much happier this way. Understanding the true story of Into the Wild has shown the intriguing life that Chris McCandless led. It might not have been a long life, but he did more with it in 24 years than some do with 80. It's perhaps no wonder Jon Krakauer wanted to document his adventure and give the wider world an insight into the man. Into the Wild becoming a bestseller and movie phenomenon was excellent for bringing more attention to the life of Chris McCandless. Unfortunately, that also had its downsides. As more people learned about his life-ending trek through the Alaskan wilderness, some decided it would be a good idea to follow in his footsteps. They wanted to find Bus 142. It's not uncommon for people to hear about a real-life adventure like this and want to try it for themselves. Many approach it with the mindset that they're more informed about the dangers than Chris was, so they won't succumb to the same fate as him. Of course, not everyone appreciates those dangers before they set off. Officials have allegedly tried to reduce the number of people trekking through the Alaskan wilderness. Over the years, they've reportedly made efforts to limit the number of people who can actually travel to Bus 142. This isn't an easy thing to do, given that some will make the trip regardless. In a way, those people embody the spirit of Chris McCandless because he didn't always follow the rules when it came to his own adventures. Knowing how dangerous it can be to reach Bus 142, you might wonder why so many people would make the trip. After all, there's every chance they could get trapped like Chris McCandless was and end up struggling to survive. However, journalist Diana Savarin apparently believes that there's an excellent reason why people put their lives on the line. According to her, Those that follow in Chris's footsteps do so because they want to experience freedom. McCandless traveled through the Alaskan wilderness after quitting his job and choosing to spend much of his life surviving in the wild. Things don't get much freer than that. Some of those who travel to Bus 142 simply want to replicate that feeling. If the true story of Into the Wild has proven anything, it's that Chris McCandless's adventure was inspirational but also dangerous. It ended with him losing his life, so it stands to reason that not everyone who decides to follow in his footsteps will make it back alive. Sadly, there have been a few losses over the years. One person who passed away doing a similar trek through the Alaskan wilderness was Claire Ackerman. She and Etienne Gross were hiking together when the Teklanika River proved to be their undoing. During her attempt to cross the river, she was reportedly carried away by the force of the river. Thankfully, Gross didn't pass away with her. It's hard to say for certain how many people have safely made it to the bus or even how many set out in search of it in the first place. Whenever a rescue effort is needed, officials sometimes have to call in the fire department and state troopers to help. It can be a big operation, which is why there have allegedly been efforts to reduce the number of people hiking this way. The fewer people there are trying to visit Bus 142, the fewer rescue attempts that are required. The trail to Bus 142 is dangerous, but there are times when it's safer to traverse. With so many people losing their lives on the trail to Bus 142, officials knew they had to do something. It was no good having so many people discover the Alaskan wilderness if they were going to keep getting stranded or passing away. How do you keep people safe in a place like this, though? Bus 142 was moved in 2020 with the hope that many more people could be inspired by the true story of Into the Wild. Those who didn't want to explore the Alaskan wilderness to visit this landmark no longer had to miss out. Meanwhile, everyone else could avoid risking their lives just to see the magic bus.